When I pulled up the long gravel driveway to my parents' house in Montana, I already felt out of place. The same white-trimmed farmhouse I grew up in looked picture-perfect under the snow-dusted roof and the yellow porch light that flickered like a welcome sign. But I knew better. My name is Nadia Ross. I'm 35, and after spending over a decade coordinating crisis response missions in war zones and disaster-struck countries, I had just resigned. Burnout didn't even begin to cover it. I came back to rural Montana for Thanksgiving, thinking maybe, just maybe, I'd get a soft landing. Instead, I walked straight into a trap. My mom greeted me at the door with a smile stretched too tight. "Nadia, you look comfortable," she said, her eyes scanning me from boots to scarf. "That coat is certainly functional." "Hi, Mom. Good to see you too," I said. I smiled, even though my jaw was already sore from clenching. Inside, the house smelled like cinnamon and roasted turkey. It was beautiful, if a little staged. Centerpieces, polished flatware, perfectly folded cloth napkins. My mother had always been obsessed with presentation, appearances, control. She'd been head of the local community council for as long as I could remember, always ready with a photo op or a favor for the press. "Brent's already here," she said, ushering me in. "He's been helping with the place cards." "Great," I said. Brent, my younger brother by 3 years, had recently been elected to the county board. He wore his new title like a crown, probably printed business cards for it. He greeted me with a lopsided grin and an arm thrown around my shoulder. "Look who finally decided to come home." "Good to see you too," I said. The dinner table was a portrait of the American holiday dream, until the words started cutting. Mom commented on my posture not 5 minutes into the meal. "You always did slouch, honey. All those years abroad and you still don't sit like a lady." "I sit like someone who's tired," I muttered, slicing into my turkey. "Oh, don't be dramatic," she said with a laugh. "It's just an observation." Brent took over the conversation almost immediately, launching into a speech about his latest policy initiative, something about land permits and modernization grants. "You know, the county really looks to us now," he said, like he was already running for higher office. I tried to chime in. "Actually, in Sudan we had a similar issue with," but he was already moving on. "Mom, pass the cranberry sauce?" I looked over at Dad, hoping for rescue. He sat at the end of the table, methodical as ever with his mashed potatoes. He'd been a pharmacist until he retired 5 years ago. Quiet, precise, impossible to read. Then he spoke. "You know, Nadia, maybe it's time you figured out what you're really doing. All that traveling, job to job. It's hard to tell what you've built." I put my fork down. "I coordinated disaster response for 8 years straight." He nodded, unbothered. "But you don't have anything steady to show for it." "Not really. Your mother and I were just talking. We've helped out a lot. Loans, support. Maybe it's time you stop floating around like driftwood." There it was. Brent laughed into his wine. "Come on, Dad. She's not driftwood. She's more like tumbleweed." Everyone chuckled, except me. I stared down at my plate, trying to breathe through it. I felt like someone had reached into my chest and knocked the wind out of me. I had come home for warmth, for a pause. Instead, I got a full-course meal of criticism served with a side of humiliation. No one said I looked tired. No one asked how I was doing. No one thanked me for sending money last year when the basement flooded, or for wiring money when Brent needed campaign seed funding. They talked about me like I wasn't even there. And for a moment, I felt like I wasn't. I had never felt so erased in a room full of people who shared my last name. The candles flickered, the laughter died down. I looked at the clock and realized I hadn't spoken in almost 10 minutes, and no one noticed. I didn't say a word. Not even when Brent launched into another story about a town hall meeting where some constituents just didn't understand how zoning worked. Not even when Mom leaned over and said, "Honey, maybe lay off the stuffing." "You look like you've put on a little since the last time we saw you." I just sat there, napkin in my lap, chewing the inside of my cheek to keep from spitting something I'd regret. When I finally moved, it was slow. I folded my napkin neatly and set it beside my plate. Mom noticed first. "Where are you going?" I stood up, walked to the hallway without answering, and grabbed my coat from the rack. My bag was already packed. I hadn't really unpacked much. I hadn't planned on staying long. "Seriously?" Brent called after me. "You're really doing this? Because Dad made a joke?" Behind me, I heard a chair scrape. "You're being dramatic, Nadia," Dad said from the dining room. No one meant anything by it. I turned around slowly and looked at them all. My parents, my brother, still seated at that perfect table with their perfect cloth napkins and centerpiece candles flickering above the untouched pumpkin pie. Exactly, I said. No one meant anything. That's the problem. Mom stood, wiping her hands on a napkin like she'd just finished a surgery. We invited you. We made dinner. You're the one walking out? You always do this. I tilted my head. Do what? Make everything into an attack. Twist our words. I shook my head. You didn't twist anything. You were very clear. Brent leaned back, arms folded like he was the principal and I was the unruly student. You've always been sensitive. No, I said calmly. I've just finally stopped pretending you don't mean exactly what you say. My heart was hammering, but my voice stayed even. Years of briefing officials in war zones taught me how to keep it level. This wasn't a fight. This was a withdrawal. I picked up my keys from the side table, then reached into my coat pocket and quietly clicked off the small voice recorder I had running all evening, a habit from my field work. I hadn't even remembered it was on until that moment. Click. The sound echoed in the quiet hallway, louder than it should have been. They froze. What was that? Dad asked, squinting. I didn't answer. I just slipped the recorder back into my coat. A tiny shift passed through the room. They knew what it meant. They remembered every word. The jokes, the digs, the driftwood comment. It was all there. I'm not using it for anything, I said, opening the door. Don't worry, it's not for you. Brent narrowed his eyes. Then what is it for? For me, I said. To remember what's real. No one stopped me. No one followed. As the door shut behind me, I felt the cold November air rush into my lungs like truth. I walked across the gravel driveway, boots crunching under me, and climbed into my car. The sky was clear, stars sharp above the empty road ahead. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just drove. Out past the edges of town, past the blinking lights, past the only world I'd ever known. The silence of the open road wrapped around me like a blanket. Honest, clean, free. It was the first real thing I'd felt all day. I checked into a budget motel just off Highway 2, the kind with flickering signs and thin walls that smelled like reheated coffee and old carpet. I didn't care. I wasn't looking for comfort. I was looking for clarity. The room was small, bed, desk, a rusted mini fridge humming in the corner. I dropped my bag, plugged in my laptop, and sat at the chipped table without taking off my coat. My fingers hovered over the keys for a second before I opened a blank spreadsheet. I didn't plan to start working. I didn't even know what I was looking for. But the numbers poured out like they'd been waiting for permission. Date, amount, description. The first one was easy. March 2018, $1,200. Emergency dental bill for Mom. Then came the campaign donation I'd voluntarily sent Brent when he was running for county board. April 2019, $1,000. Seed money, even though I wasn't even registered to vote in Montana anymore. Then the wire I sent in 2020 when Dad's pharmacy pension got temporarily frozen. I had skipped a meal that day, working a flood response in Jakarta, but still found a cell tower and a bank branch to get it done. July 2020, $3,500. Pension delay. One by one, the entries added up. Every Zelle, every Venmo, every wire. By the time I was halfway through, I had to color code just to keep things straight. Red for urgent, yellow for guilt-tripped, gray for misused. The gray filled up fast. I started remembering things I hadn't let myself think about in years. The time I was in Haiti, trying to secure clean water for a cholera outbreak, when Mom messaged about an overdue furnace repair. It's going to get cold this week, sweetheart. You don't want your mother to freeze, do you? Or the time Brent called me crying about rent, even though I'd just seen him post a photo from a cabin retreat with his buddies. It's just a rough patch, he'd said. You know how it is. And I did. I really did. Because every time they needed something, I moved mountains. I rewired my day, skipped sleep, missed meetings, converted currencies, talked to banks across time zones. I gave up so much, and they never remembered. Not once had any of them said, "That must have been hard for you." Not once had anyone asked, "Are you okay?" When I was calling from refugee camps or earthquake zones, they just said, "Can you help?" I scrolled down the list. Dozens of rows, thousands of dollars. All of it given quietly, with no record, until now. I started a new tab and labeled it Sacrifices. I didn't mean for it to sound dramatic. I just needed to see it. Skipped birthdays, 5 canceled flights home, 3 missed friend weddings, 4 nights with less than 3 hours sleep. Too many to count. Meals skipped so I could afford a wire fee. 9 vacations taken in the last decade. Or I sat back and stared at it all. This wasn't just a spreadsheet. This was my history, my labor, my silence. The betrayal hadn't come in one loud moment. It came in layers. In every casual, "You're so lucky to travel" comment when I was sleeping in tents beside mass graves. In every, "You never really settle anywhere" joke when I was moving from crisis to crisis with nothing but a duffel bag and duty. They used my mobility as an insult. They called it instability, aimlessness, driftwood. But I had held the line, in every way that mattered, for them. And now, with every cell I filled, I felt that grip loosen. My laptop fan buzzed loudly. The motel walls groaned with someone else's television. My stomach growled, but I didn't move. I wasn't hungry for food. I was starving for truth. And now, I had it. Not to argue, not to confront, just to finally see it for myself. All that invisible labor, visible now, undeniable, and mine. A week later, I pulled into my parents' driveway without calling ahead. Not because I wanted a confrontation, I didn't. I was just curious. I needed to see it with my own eyes. The house looked different. The same siding, same shutters, but everything had been updated. The cracked sidewalk was replaced with fresh concrete, new mulch, brand new shutters in deep blue. The porch swing I remembered as creaky and paint chipped now gleamed under a fresh coat of lacquer. It all looked like a listing photo. I parked down the block and walked the last 100 feet. There was a new fire pit in the backyard. Not just a cheap one from the hardware store. This was built in, with custom brickwork and Adirondack chairs arranged like it belonged in a home magazine spread. I circled around the side gate and stepped into the yard like I used to as a teenager coming home late. Quiet, invisible. Inside, through the back sliding doors, I saw Brent on the couch, a curved monitor glowing in front of him, one hand lazily cradling a glass bottle of some imported soda. His feet were up, shoes off, socks pristine white. He didn't look stressed. He looked comfortable. So this is where it went, I thought. The grants, the repairs, the emergencies. Brent yelled something into his headset, some joke, something dumb, and then laughed at his own punchline. He hadn't noticed me. I stood there for another beat, taking it all in. Then the garage door creaked open and I heard voices. Mom and Dad came walking through the yard, arms full of tote bags that read Furniture Expo 2023, Missoula. She was smiling, Dad nodding like he'd had a productive afternoon. They froze when they saw me standing in the grass. "Oh," Mom said, adjusting her sunglasses. "Nadia." Dad didn't speak, just squinted at me like I was a shadow. I held my ground. "I was in the area," I said evenly. "Thought I'd drop by." Mom shifted the bags to her other shoulder. "Well, you should have called. We weren't expecting—" "I know," I said. That was the point. Brent finally noticed something was happening and came to the door, a controller still in his hand. "What's this?" he asked like I was the problem. I took a slow breath and nodded toward the fire pit. "Nice upgrade." Mom opened her mouth, probably to explain how they saved or got a deal. I cut her off before she could start. "I just have one question," I said, turning to all 3 of them. "Do you remember the wire I sent in May? The one for the plumbing emergency?" Dad cleared his throat. "Yes, of course, it was urgent." "Plumbing emergency," I said again, looking directly at him. "Was that before or after you booked the landscaping company?" No one answered. Brent tried to laugh. "Oh, come on. You're acting like we went on a shopping spree." I pulled out my phone, opened the spreadsheet. "Actually," I said, scrolling, "you kinda did." I listed it calmly. The cash I sent for Mom's medical treatment that coincided with the new patio umbrella. The funds for Dad's truck repair that, according to a time-stamped photo, never actually happened. The $1,200 I wired to Brent for campaign outreach the same week he posted about his deserved weekend getaway. Each line was a brick. I stacked them. They stared like I'd slapped them, but I never raised my voice. "This is what I gave," I said, showing the screen. "This." I gestured around the yard, the house, the glow of that curved monitor. Is what you built. Brent stepped forward, face flushed. Why are you doing this? Doing what? I asked. Looking at the receipts? Dad finally spoke. You're being unfair. We didn't take anything that wasn't needed. I met his eyes. It was needed, just not by you. The wind stirred the trees. For a second, no one spoke. Then Mom tried again, softer this time. Honey, you've always been generous. We were just trying to keep things afloat. I nodded. Funny, I've been trying to keep myself afloat for years, alone in other countries on 30-hour shifts, but I never had time for a backyard fire pit. You're twisting things, she said quietly. No, I said. I'm just naming them. I took one last look at the house. I used to think it meant something. That porch, that kitchen, that swing. But it was just a set now. A place where they rehearsed being a family while I sent the checks that kept the lights on. I turned to leave. Nadia, Dad said behind me, more forceful now. Where are you going? Home, I said, already walking. The one I actually pay for. I didn't look back. Not at Brent standing with his arms crossed like a bored bailiff. Not at Mom clutching her expo bags. Not at Dad scowling like I'd made a scene in his kingdom. I just kept walking, the gravel crunching under my boots until I reached my car. And this time, I didn't drive away angry, I drove away clear. Back in Washington, the first thing I did was open my laptop. I didn't make tea, I didn't unpack. I sat down at my kitchen table, opened a new tab, and drafted a single email addressed to 3 people: Mom, Dad, Brent. The subject line was short, effective immediately. I kept it simple. No rants, no recaps. This email is to confirm that, effective immediately, I will no longer be providing financial assistance to any member of this family. This includes, but is not limited to, direct transfers, indirect subsidies, or emergency contributions of any kind. This is a permanent decision. Please do not reply requesting reconsideration. Nadia. I read it once, then again. My finger hovered over the send button for half a second. Then I pressed it. It was like flipping off a switch I hadn't even realized was humming in the background of my life. The quiet afterward was sharp and clean. I shut the laptop and waited. Didn't take long. 15 minutes later, the first ping came in. Mom, sweetheart, I think you're being emotional. We should talk about this. I know you've had a lot on your plate lately, and maybe that's clouding your judgment. Then came Brent. Brent, wow, dramatic much. So you're just going to pretend we're strangers now? You need help, Nadia. Real help. This is unhinged. A beat later, Dad chimed in. Dad, Nadia, this is rash. You're cutting ties over a couple misunderstandings. Family is messy. Always has been. You can't expect perfection. This kind of reaction proves you're still not ready to settle down. Reliable people don't ghost their families. I didn't reply. I just turned off notifications. Then I stood up, walked out the front door, and started running. Not jogging. Not thinking about heart rate or pace, just running. My lungs burned in the crisp evening air. My breath came in sharp bursts, my shoes pounding against the pavement, steady and rhythmic, like I was trying to outrun everything I'd carried for the last 15 years. Every mile peeled back something I hadn't even realized was weighing me down. The shame of not being who they wanted. The guilt of not being available fast enough, generous enough, selfless enough. The exhaustion of being the backbone no one ever thanked, just leaned on. By the 3rd mile, my body ached. My throat was dry, but my head was clear. Back at home, I peeled off my sweat-soaked clothes and stepped into the shower. The water hit my back like truth. I didn't cry. I didn't think about what came next. I just breathed. The next morning, my supervisor noticed something during our standing check-in. You look sharper, she said, eyeing me over her coffee mug. Rested even. I smiled. Not wide, just enough. I finally stopped dragging dead weight. She raised an eyebrow. Work-related? No, I said. Life. That night, after a quiet dinner alone, I opened a new note in my phone and typed one line. This is what freedom feels like. Then I set my phone down, put on my running shoes again, and stepped into the street, lighter than I had felt in years. The land lease program had popped up on my radar months ago, buried in an inbox I barely checked anymore. A pilot initiative in northern Idaho, off-grid properties available for long-term lease to applicants willing to maintain and restore them. Most people clicked past it. I bookmarked it. Now, with no family obligations anchoring me, I applied. A week later, I got a call confirming approval. 3 weeks after that, I was driving through a canyon with my windows down and a rusted trailer hitched behind me, packed with tools, camping gear, and everything that didn't remind me of them. The cabin was smaller than I expected. The roof sagged at one corner, the steps creaked, and the inside smelled like cedar and dust. A pile of animal droppings greeted me in the kitchen. One of the windows was taped over with cardboard. I stood in the doorway with a broom in one hand and a dead mouse on the floor. It was perfect, because it was mine. No one asked for anything. No one watched. No one expected. That first week, I didn't try to do everything. I swept. I patched a leak in the roof. I replaced the batteries in an old carbon monoxide detector. I hauled brush from behind the outhouse and stacked it in a rough, crooked line to keep deer away from the door. Every night, I sat by the wood stove and journaled. 3 words, the same every time. Debt-free, present, enough. I didn't write about Mom's guilt trips. I didn't write about Brent's mockery. I didn't need to. That part of me wasn't gone, but it wasn't in charge anymore. The second week, a note appeared on my porch, wedged under a mason jar filled with raspberry preserves. Welcome. Let me know if you need help clearing the West Side Trail. Eli, Blue House past the logging road. I stared at the handwriting for a long time. Help, offered with no strings, no agenda. I left the jar unopened on the windowsill for 3 days before I allowed myself a spoonful. It was good, better than good. By the 3rd week, I had a rhythm. Up at dawn, chop wood, haul buckets from the well, clear brush, fix one thing a day. I bought a folding solar panel, installed a composting toilet, rewired the breaker box with a YouTube tutorial, and more swearing than I'll ever admit. Every step was mine. Every blister, every bruise, earned and accounted for. The first night it snowed, I wrapped myself in 2 blankets and sat on the porch with a thermos of instant coffee, watching the forest swallow the color from the sky. There was no Wi-Fi, no buzzing phone, no passive-aggressive texts, no performance evaluations masked as dinner conversations. Just wind and space. I slept better than I had in 10 years. Some mornings, Eli would pass by and wave, always from a respectful distance. He never stayed long. Once, he dropped off firewood and said, "Heard a coyote last night, probably just passing through," then walked away. He never asked why I was there, which is probably why I didn't mind when he came. One afternoon, while repairing a hole in the cabin siding, I found a rusty horseshoe buried in the dirt. I cleaned it up and nailed it beside the door, not for luck, just for weight. A reminder that things could stay where I put them. A month passed, then 2. I marked the days with pencil scratches on a beam above the fireplace. I wrote short entries in my notebook, just thoughts and small wins. Fixed the roof seam today. Birds nested in the back eave. Left them alone. Made soup from lentils and nothing else. It was still enough. Sometimes I reread the spreadsheet, the one from the motel, not to get angry, just to remember, because this wasn't a retreat. It wasn't running away. It was rebuilding. From zero. The isolation didn't scare me. The quiet didn't feel empty. It felt honest. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't living someone else's version of worthy. I was just living, and that was more than enough. By late spring, I had turned a plot of stubborn dirt behind the cabin into something real. The soil fought me at first, dry, rocky, full of weeds, but I'd worked tougher ground before. Crisis zones taught me that growth doesn't need permission, just persistence. The first radishes broke through the earth in May. They were crooked and too spicy, but they were mine. Rootline produce was born out of a joke I made to Eli one morning while we were fixing a broken fence on my property line. "You keep this up," he said, wiping sweat from his brow, "and you'll be feeding half the mountain." "Maybe I will," I replied. "Welcome to Rootline, unofficially stubborn, certified broke." He laughed, a real one. A week later, I took a folding table down to the farmer's market in town. I didn't know what to expect, just me. A crate of radishes, 3 jars of pickled beets, and a hand-painted sign that said, "Rootline Produce. Honest food from one person's hard restart." A few people stopped. A couple asked questions. One woman looked at my beets and said, "These look like the kind my grandma used to make." She bought 2 jars. By noon, I had sold out. It wasn't about the money, it was the exchange. Honest work for honest interest. The next week, I brought more. Carrots, barely straight. Turnips I had no clue what to do with. I bartered with a neighbor for goat cheese, traded beets for soap, gave a lonely kid a whole bundle of kale just because he said he wanted to surprise his mom. People remembered me, not for what I used to do or where I'd been, just for the produce and the label on each jar, made by hand, grown with purpose. At the market, a woman named Riley asked me, "Do you do CSA boxes?" "Not yet," I said, startled that anyone would think I had systems in place. "You should," she said. "I'd subscribe. My daughter loves your radishes. Says they bite back." So I bought a spiral notebook from the gas station and started tracking customers. Just names, numbers, what they liked. Riley, Theo, Grandma May, a couple who signed their order form with smiley faces. Every entry felt like a new kind of ledger, not like the spreadsheet in the motel. That one was built on guilt. This one was built on trade, trust, effort. Eli helped me reinforce the greenhouse when a storm rolled through in June. We didn't talk much while we worked, just tools, weather, soil. That evening, he left a basket on my porch. Inside was homemade sourdough and a single, perfect tomato. No note. Didn't need one. A few weeks later, someone at the market asked me, "Where's your family from? You got any relatives around here?" I didn't hesitate. "No, they're not part of this build." That was the phrase I kept repeating in my head. Not part of this build, not in resentment. Just fact. Every raised bed, every jar of pickles, every early morning, and every dirt-streaked hand was part of a life I made without being needed by people who only saw me as useful when it suited them. That part of my story was over. I opened a second notebook just for farm notes. Yields, pests, weather patterns, what grew fast and what refused. I titled the first page, Year 1, Starting from Worth. Every day I wrote something, even if it was just dug potatoes, felt strong, or neighbor's dog ate my lettuce again, laughed anyway. Rootline didn't explode overnight. It didn't need to. I wasn't building an empire. I was building a rhythm, and it held. For the first time, I didn't have to ask if I belonged somewhere. The land answered for me, and I believed it. They arrived on a Saturday. No warning, no call, no reason. I was setting out eggs for the farm stand when I saw a shiny SUV creeping up the dirt road. It didn't belong to anyone local. The tires hesitated at every pothole like they were afraid to get scratched. I stood still, half a dozen brown eggs in my hand as it pulled into my driveway. When the doors opened, I saw them, my parents, dressed like they were going wine tasting. Dad in loafers and slacks. Mom in a flowing scarf and pastel jacket like she expected a table reservation and a wine flight. She was holding a pie. Cherry, I think. "Sweetheart," she called, waving as if she were someone's neighbor dropping by for lemonade. I didn't move. Dad smiled like this was normal, like he hadn't spent the past 6 months sending passive-aggressive silence my way. They walked up the gravel path together, her heels wobbling in the stones. The pie was in a glass dish with a fabric cover, like something from a magazine shoot. I crossed my arms. "What are you doing here?" We thought we'd come see how things are going," Mom said, tone too bright. "You know, now that you've gotten yourself established out here." Dad nodded. "Looks like you've built quite the operation." I looked past them. The back of their SUV was open. I saw a cardboard box filled with what looked like brochures, pamphlets. "Are those business packets?" I asked. "Oh," Mom said, caught. "Well, we just thought if you were looking to expand, maybe we could help." "Help," I repeated, the word sour in my mouth. Dad stepped in. "You're clearly doing something right. We thought we could support that. You know, be involved." Mom thrust the pie forward like it was a peace treaty. "And we brought dessert. It sat there between us. That glass dish. Like it could erase everything. I didn't touch it." "You never visited me once when I was overseas," I said. "Not in 12 years. "Well, those weren't exactly safe places," Dad said. "But now that I have a farm stand and homegrown beets," I said, "you're suddenly interested." Mom huffed. "We're trying to rebuild, Nadia." "No," I said. You're trying to profit from a structure you never helped build. Her smile faltered. Don't be cruel. Cruel? I said. Cruel is asking for money for emergency dental work and then using it to install a luxury patio umbrella. Cruel is watching your daughter burn herself out on the other side of the world and never asking if she was okay. Dad's voice hardened. That's enough. I pulled out my phone, opened the spreadsheet, scrolled. You want numbers, I said. Let's do this properly. I turned the screen toward them. Total transfers, 41,035. Travel reimbursements for fake emergencies, 3,800. Election donations I was guilted into, 2,500. Upgrades I didn't authorize but paid for anyway, $700. Oh, and Brent's soda subscription? That was $312 a year. Imported. Mango lychee. Mom blinked. Dad took a step back. I kept going. I have the emails, the receipts, the bank records, even the one where Mom told me, just send it quickly so we don't have to explain it to your father. That's out of context, she whispered. No, I said. It's just in writing. For a long moment, the only sound was the rustle of wind through the pine trees. You're our daughter, Dad finally said. Family doesn't keep score. I locked eyes with him. You kept score the second you called me Driftwood. You just didn't expect me to write it down? He stared, silent. I took a deep breath and pointed at the pie. You can take that back to the car. Mom didn't move. Now, I said. She turned slowly, her hand trembling as she clutched the dish. They walked back together, slower this time, like they finally felt the weight of the gravel under their shoes. At the car, Dad turned around. If you leave us behind, Nadia, he said, don't expect us to be there when things go south. I almost laughed. You never were. He flinched. I watched them drive away, kicking up dust like ghosts retreating from something they couldn't haunt anymore. Then I walked back to the stand, picked up my eggs, and got back to work. I didn't need to go back, but I did. Not for closure, not for kindness, just for the record. 3 days after they showed up at my farm unannounced, I drove back to my parents' house in Montana. This time I called ahead, not to ask permission, but to avoid excuses. I'm coming by Wednesday, I told Mom flatly. Have Brent there too. There was a pause. All right, she said, voice clipped. I pulled into the driveway just before noon. The porch still looked spotless. That stupid fire pit still sat proudly in the backyard like a trophy. The only thing different was the silence. They were waiting in the dining room when I stepped inside. Mom sitting at the head of the table like she was presiding over a brunch. Dad beside her, arms folded. Brent showed up late, hoodie halfway zipped, acting like I was wasting his time. I set the manila folder on the table. What's this? Brent asked, glancing at it like it might be boring. Documentation, I said, line by line, every transfer, every favor, every lie. Dad gave a dry laugh. You printed it out? I looked him straight in the eye. Some things deserve to be held in hand. They didn't open it right away. I did it for them. I flipped to the first page, April 2017, $500. Mom's emergency dental, uninsured. Then the receipt from the actual clinic, which listed a total cost of $0, thanks to a state plan she'd enrolled in that same year. You told me the state wouldn't cover it, I said quietly. Mom shifted in her seat. It was complicated. No, I said, it wasn't. I flipped the page. Brent's campaign donations. 2 transfers marked urgent that were spent, according to his own social media, on a weekend trip and a new gaming chair. He tried to interrupt. Okay, I didn't ask for... You did, I said, and I sent it. You thanked me with a meme and a joke about being my favorite investment. Page after page, receipts, texts, screenshots, color-coded totals. They didn't speak. I didn't come here to yell, I said. I didn't come for an apology either. Then what did you come for? Dad asked, arms crossed tighter. To be clear, I said. For the record, I'm done. Brent scoffed. We know you're done. You already sent your dramatic little email. I turned to him. You treated me like a walking debit card. You never once asked how I was doing. You ignored me at dinner, mocked my work, and laughed when Dad called me Driftwood. Now you're upset that the well ran dry? He rolled his eyes. I didn't care. I faced my mother. You knew, every time I sent money, Every time I adjusted my life so you could maintain yours. Her lips parted, but no words came out. I was in Haiti during a hurricane when you texted me to help with the property taxes. You wrote, "It's just a little push to keep us from slipping." I leaned closer. I was sleeping on a cot next to a flooded street when I wired that money. Still nothing. Dad finally broke the silence. "You're holding a grudge." "No," I said. "I'm holding proof." I pushed the folder toward them and stood. "This is yours now. Keep it. Burn it. Frame it." "Doesn't matter to me." I started walking toward the door. "You're just going to walk out?" Mom asked, voice shaking. "I've walked out before," I said. "But this is different." "What about us?" she asked, rising slightly. "You're just cutting us off forever?" "I'm not cutting you off," I said, pausing at the threshold. "I'm leaving you with what you built." "And what's that supposed to mean?" Dad snapped. "It means I'm done paying for your version of love." I opened the door. The air outside was dry and cool. Wind in the trees. The porch creaked the same way it always had. But I was different. My shoulders weren't tight. My breath wasn't caught in my chest. I stepped off the porch and walked to my car without looking back. That night back in Idaho, I slept through the night without waking once. No dreams, just peace. 3 months later, I stood behind a folding podium at the Northwest Regional Sustainability Panel in Spokane. The room was full: farmers, students, city planners, and people who just wanted to learn how to grow something that wasn't rooted in burnout. I wasn't there as a guest of honor. I wasn't even a scheduled speaker, but a slot opened when someone canceled, and the coordinator, a soft-spoken woman named Tess, who had bought turnips from me twice at the market, asked if I'd be willing to talk about building a solo microfarm from scratch. "I'm not sure I'm the person," I had said. Tess smiled. "That's exactly why you are." So I agreed. And now, standing there in worn jeans and a flannel shirt that still smelled faintly like soil, I told my story. Not all of it. Not the dinner insults or the fake emergencies or the pie on the porch. Just the truth that mattered. "I used to coordinate crisis missions overseas," I began. "Earthquakes, floods, conflict zones. But the most subtle extraction system I ever experienced wasn't in a war zone. It was in a family structure." The room went quiet. A few pens stopped scribbling. I continued. "Sometimes systems aren't violent. They're quiet. They call themselves love, obligation, tradition, and they bleed you dry without leaving a mark." I talked about burnout, about financial enmeshment, about the way invisible labor is often expected, never repaid, and always downplayed. And then I talked about the farm, about rootline produce, and the radishes that bit back, and the bartered goat cheese and handwritten orders, and my neighbor Eli, who once showed up just to hand me a new pair of work gloves because he noticed mine were splitting. I told them how I had replaced a spreadsheet of guilt with a notebook full of names and growing seasons. "This wasn't just healing," I said near the end. "It was strategy. I didn't rebuild because I'm brave. I rebuilt because I was done. I needed to live in a space where being enough wasn't up for debate." There was no applause at first, just silence. Then, slowly, people began to nod and clap. But it wasn't the kind of applause meant to celebrate. It was quiet, respectful. Like they were saying, "I heard you." Afterward, people came up to me one by one. No one asked for advice. No one tried to fix me. They just said thank you. One woman hugged me and whispered, "I stopped wiring money last week. Your words helped." A man shook my hand and said, "I didn't know it was okay to walk away. Now I do." Back at the cabin that night, I took off my boots at the door and stepped inside to the smell of firewood and dill. The barn cat, who had shown up in June and never left, wound himself around my ankles, demanding dinner. I poured kibble into his bowl and scratched behind his ear. Then I sat at the table, opened my fresh logbook, and wrote one sentence. This was never about being needed. It was about being whole. I closed the book, exhaled, and watched the moon rise through the window. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was earned.